Masechet Makkot Daf Yod Zayin. Achal tevel u'maaser rishon. The Mishnah mentioned that if someone eats tebel, that's produce from which you have not taken teruma or maaser, then one gets lashes. Okay, that makes sense. That's tebel. And then the Mishnah continues and says, also, if someone eats maaser rishon and the teruma was not taken from that, even if it's a Levi eating it, and you give it to a Levi, but he didn't give teruma, that's also called tebel. And if anybody eats that, they will get also lashes. Furthermore, maaser sheni, you separated the maaser sheni, but that has holiness to it and must be eaten in Yerushalayim, same as hekdesh. If you redeem it, that's okay. But if you don't redeem it and you eat it, then you get lashes. So we covered teruma, maaser rishon, maaser sheni. All of these things, if one eats it, one gets lashes. There's one that's missing from the Mishnah, and that is maaser ani. What about that? Amar Rav, achal tebel shel maasad ani loke. Rav says, if one eats produce from which you took the teruma, you took maaser rishon, and we're talking about a third or sixth year of the Shemitah of cycle. In the third and sixth year, you don't take maaser sheni that you eat in Yerushalayim, rather maaser ani. So you took teruma and maaser rishon, but not maaser ani, and you do not separate it, and you eat that tebel. Is one liable to lashes? Rav says yes, even though it doesn't say so explicitly in the Mishnah, it is also true. Now, why would anyone think that maaser ani would be any different from anything else? Well, it is different because maaser ani is it's a serious obligation, but it's merely a monetary obligation to give it to the ani. There's no holiness in the maaser ani. If that poor person wanted to sell it, give it to somebody else, in fact, anybody can eat it. Unlike teruma, which has holiness in it. So therefore, that would be a prohibition. It's prohibition for a non-Kohen to eat teruma. And if teruma was not separated from the tebel, okay, then it makes sense that if someone eats that tebel, then this teruma mixed in, the teruma has not been taken out, one would get lashes. But you might think maaser ani is only a monetary obligation, as we will see. Anyway, Rav says there's no difference. Eating tebel and without having taken maaser ani, also one gets lashes. Keman ki hay tana. What Tana is Rav following? He's following the Tana of the following Baraita, the Tanya. Amar Rabbi Yosef, Yachol lo yehe chayav ela ala tebel shelo hura mimenu kol ikar, hura mimenu teruma gedola velo hiram mimenu maaser rishon velo maaser sheni, va'afilu maaser ani minayin. So Rabbi Yosef asks, we didn't get to the answer yet. He says, you might think, could it be that one would only be liable to lashes if one ate tebel from which nothing was taken, right? Maybe that's the law. You didn't separate anything; it's pure tebel. Then you get lashes. But you might think that maybe if teruma gedola was taken, but not yet maaser rishon, maybe you wouldn't get lashes. How do you know that you get lashes in that case? Or if you took maaser rishon, but not maaser sheni, so how do you know that you'd get lashes in that case? And even maaser ani. What if you took maaser teruma and you took maaser rishon? There's no problem there, but you didn't take maaser ani, so it's tebel with only maaser ani still yet to be taken out. How do we know that in all those cases also one gets lashes? Talmud Omar, lo tuchal lechol bisharecha vegomer. Ulalanu omer, v'achelu bisharecha v'sabeu. Ma lehalan maaser ani, afkan maaser ani, v'marachamana lo tuchal. It's because Pasuk says in Devarim chapter 12, you cannot eat, and this is talking about maaser sheni, you cannot eat it and in your gates, but rather you have to bring it to Yerushalayim. Now this bisharecha is also stated in Devarim 26, which is talking about maaser ani, that you can eat in your gates, but you have to share it with the orphan, the widow, and so on, with the poor. Now we make a gezerah shava, bisharecha and bisharecha, just like in the second pasuk where it says bisharecha, and that is in fact the context of maaser ani. So too in this pasuk, the first one, which in Peshat is talking about in fact maaser sheni, but because of the gezerah shava, bisharecha arecha bisharecha, we're going to apply this lo tuchal also to Maaser Ani. That's what it means here. Afkan Maaser Ani. So we're going to treat this prohibition as if it's applying to Maaser Ani also, not just Maaser Sheni. And the pasuk says, Lo tuchal, one may not eat it. That's a lav. And if there's a lav, that means if one violates the lav, one gets malkut. And so from here we learn that one gets lashes if one eats Maaser Tebel, from which you did not take Maaser Rishon, and Maaser Sheni. Maaser Sheni is from this pasuk, Lo tuchal, and also Maaser Ani, because of the Gezerah Shava. So there you go. No matter what type of Tebel it is, that is going to be a problem. Therefore, we can conclude that Rav is following this Tana of Rabbi Yosef in this Baraita. Amar Rav Yosef, Ketanae. Rav Yosef says, hold on, although Rav is following Rabbi Yosef, who says that Maaser Ani also is considered tebel. If you didn't take maaser ani, then that's considered tebel, and one would be liable to lashes. It's true, Rabbi Yosef says that in that baraita. However, Rabbi Yosef says this is actually subject to a machloket tanaim. Ketanae. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, en sarich likrot et Hashem al maaser ani shel demai. Hachamim omerim koreh et Hashem ve'no sarich leafrish. If one has demai, that's produce that one buys from an ama'aretz. And Amei Ha'aretz, they're not very reliable in taking Teruman Maaser. So we're not sure if you take Teruman Maaser or not. And therefore, when it comes to Terumah, Maaser Rishon, you have to take it just in case. It's a Drabanan, just in case the Ha'aretz did not take it. The question is, what about Maaser Ani? Do you have to take Maaser Ani from this? Rabbi Eliezer says you don't have to. You don't even have to call it a name. You don't even have to designate any part of it. That, okay, 10% of this will be Maaser Ani. You don't have to do anything about Maaser Ani. It's different from Terumah and Maaser Rishon because Maaser Ani is, again, only a monetary obligation. It's a debt that you have to give to the Ani, but it doesn't have holiness status. And therefore, you can claim, listen, if there's any poor person that knows for sure and can prove that the Ha'aretz did not separate Maaser Ani, so let him come and prove it, and then he could take it. Anybody around? No, there's nobody here. Nobody can prove it, and therefore the owner can simply keep it. And since he can simply keep it, he doesn't even have to designate it because it's tebel. It's tebel of because you haven't taken Maaser Ani. But there's no prohibition here. The prohibition does not apply to Maaser Ani, seemingly according to the Eliezer. Chachamim, however, say, well, no, you do have to do something. You have to designate it as a name, even though you don't have to physically separate it. You have to look at this produce and say, 10% of this, somewhere mixed in, wherever, is Maaser Ani. Okay, then you could say any Aniyim here that can prove that it's theirs, nobody around, and then you can eat it. But you do have to designate it because otherwise it's tebel with it mixed in. So you have to separate, not physically separate it, but call it a name, and that way legally separate it. And once it's separated, then it's not called tebel anymore. But if you don't separate it, then it's tebel because you didn't separate the maaser ani. And there is a prohibition, seemingly, according to that opinion. So let's analyze. What is the essence of the machloket? It seems to be that, according to the second opinion of Rabbanan, let's say it was vadai. Let's say you knew for sure. You bought it from someone who 100% knows that they took terumah, they took maaser rishon. So I did not take maaser ani. And what if one would eat that? So what if it's for sure that you didn't take maaser ani? Would there be prohibition there? And so Rabbanan would say, yes, that's tebel. That's definitely tebel, and it will be you'd get lashes. So the opinion of Rabbanan that would fit with Rabbi Yosef in the Baraita above and with Rav's opinion. However, Rabbi Eliezer says even if for sure there's maaser ani, mixed in here, it's not called tebel, and there's no prohibition. And that's why he says you don't even have to designate it, you don't even have to separate it at all. And so this would be a different opinion that disagrees with Rabbanan and disagrees with Rabbi Yosef and Rav above. So is there not a machloket here? Amar le Abaye ihachi ad mipalge besfeko liflegu bevadai. So Abaye tells Rav Yosef thought it was a machloket Tanaim. Abaye says no, it can't be, because if they were arguing about this fundamental issue, then why would they be arguing about demai? Where not sure if Maaser Ani was taken or not. Talk about a case of vadai, because that'll be a stronger exemplification of their machloket. So talk about this vadai. If that's what the machloket is based on, don't tell me a side product. Tell me the main machloket. So you know what? It must be not so. Ela dekula ama vadai toblo. Must be everybody agrees that if this is for sure produce that you for sure did not take Maaser Ani, then that would be tebel, and that would be prohibited. That is consistent with Rabbi Yosef and the Baraita above, and Rav. Yes, you would even get lashes if you ate that tebel, and everybody agrees with that, even Rabbi Eliezer. So the argument is as follows: Mor sabar lo nechshedu ha'aretz al ma'asar ani shel demai, kevan demamonahu afrush mafrish. V'Rabbanan sabre kevan tericha le mileta la mafrish. Rabbi Eliezer thinks that Amei Haaretz are not suspect for not taking Maaser Ani. They all separate Maaser Ani. You know why? Because it is so-called merely a monetary obligation to give it to the poor, but they may just keep it for themselves, which would violate stealing, but it wouldn't be non-kosher. Unlike Tirumah, where if they separate Tirumah, then eating Tirumah themselves, if they're not a Kohen, is a very serious prohibition. Then they're going to have to give that away. And other things also. They're going to have to give it to a Levi. They're going to have to eat in Yerushalayim. And they don't want to lose out on these items, so they may not separate it at all. That's where they're suspect. When it comes to Maaser Ani, where there's no prohibition for anybody to eat it, so you know what they'll do? They'll separate it, and then they'll just keep it for themselves and not give it to an ani. Since they're not losing out money, they say, okay, may as well separate it. Therefore, that's why Rabbi Eliezer says that if it's demai you got from the Amaaretz, then you can assume he separated Maaser Ani, and you don't have to do it. That was his reason for the Pesach. Whereas, although he agreed that if it's not separated and it's tebel, because you didn't take Maaser Ani, that would be prohibited, and that would be tebel, and even have lashes. That he agrees with that, but he assumes that once you separate it, it's not holy, and anybody could eat it. So they just don't give it. They refuse to give it to the ani, which is bad, but that's what they do. Rabbanan, however, disagree, and they say that since it's an exertion to separate maaser ani, I mean, you have to go and separate it. It could be that there's a lot of it, so it's a chore to do. So they don't bother. Even though, if they would, maybe they would keep it for themselves. So it's not about the money, it's true, but it is still a chore that they have to do. And because they're meharetz, they're just not so careful with it. And therefore, we have to suspect that it is tebel, even for maaser ani, which would be prohibited. And therefore, one does have to separate it, even though you don't have to actually give it to a poor person, because let the poor person prove that it belongs to him. The Mishnah continues and says, Kama yochal min ha-tebel. How much do you have to eat from tebel in order to be liable to lashes? And we saw two opinions. Rabbanan say a kezayit. Rabbi Shimon said kol shehu, even a little bit. Amar Bevai, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Machloket bechita, aval bekemach divrei kol kezayit. Rabbi Bevai says in the name of Resh Lakish that this machloket is only regarding a kernel. If you have a whole kernel, then Rabbanan would say, how big is this kernel? Less than a kezayit? No lashes. Rabbi Shimon says, it's a whole kernel, even if it's a tiny kernel, because it's a whole creation, but it comes like that in nature. Therefore, since it's a whole thing, one does get lashes. So that's where the machloket is. But if it's ground up, well, then that's not a whole creation. So everybody would agree, even Rabbi Shimon would agree, that you need a kezayit, of flour, in order to be liable to lashes. Rabbi Yirmiyah amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish kemachloket bezo, kach machloket bezo. Rabbi Yirmiyah disagrees with Rabbi Abai's report of what Resh Lakish said, and he thinks that according to Resh Lakish, the machloket between Rabbanan and Rabbi Shimon applies both to a kernel and to ground flour. For sure, it refers to a kernel, because that's what their dialogue is about. But it also refers to ground flour. Even there, Rabbi Shimon would say the smallest bit of ground flour, if one eats it and it's tebel, one would be liable to lashes. The Gemara next challenges Rabbi Yirmiyah's interpretation from our Mishnah, where there's a continuation with a dialogue. Let's quote the Mishnah. Tenan, Amar lehem Rabbi Shimon, Iatem modim li be'ochel nemala kol shehu chayav. Rabbi Shimon asks Rabbanan, wouldn't you agree with me that if someone eats an ant, a whole ant, that one is liable, even though the ant is very small? So why are you saying you need a kezayit? You see, even less than a kezayit, an ant that's small. So I say the same thing about grain. Even if tebel, even if it's a little bit, should be the same thing. Amru lo mipnei shehi kebiryata. But the rabbis answered Rabbi Shimon, no, regarding an ant, that is how it's created. That's a creation. An ant is a whole being. So that's why even if it's small, it's significant in and of itself, and one is liable to lashes, unlike grain. Amar lehen, afchita achat kebiryata. Rabbi Shimon says, wait, a kernel of grain, also, that's how it's created. So that's a whole item. That's how it grows in nature. So you should consider that also to be a whole item. What can we learn from this conversation? Chita in kemachla. Look how Rabbi Shimon argues that why is one liable to lashes even if something is less than a kezayit? Only because it's a kernel, because it's a whole item. But if it would be ground up and just a little bit of flour, then Rabbi Shimon would not say that one is liable unless you have a kezayit of flour. And so that supports the first report of Rabbi Vai, and it's a challenge to Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah can answer as follows. Ledivrehem kamar lehu. Rabbi Shimon is just giving an argument according to the view of the rabbis, but he himself doesn't even agree with the steps that he's saying in order to counter them. He says, Lididi afilu kemach nami. Rabbi Shimon says, according to me, I think even a little bit of flour that's tebel, one would get lashes. Ela ledidchu. But according to you, you should at least agree with me that a whole kernel, that's how it grows, because after all, you agree regarding an ant that if it's small, because it's a whole being, one is liable to lashes. So too, a whole being of a kernel of wheat, that's a whole being, so one should also be liable. So now if you put it that way, that is a good question. In any case, how will the rabbis answer the challenge? If it's something that has a soul, and an ant, okay, it doesn't have a human soul, but it has a soul, it moves, it makes decisions, maybe instinctually, but it does things. So even an ant has some kind of a neshama, so that is considered a significant item, even though it's small, less than the kezayit, it's significant. Whereas a kernel of wheat, that does not have a neshama, and it's not, you don't call that alive, and therefore it's not considered significant, and so you need an entire kezayit. Tanya kivated Rabbi Yirmiyah. Even though we challenged Rabbi Yirmiyah, there is actually a baraita that supports Rabbi Yirmiyah's interpretation. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kol shehu lemakot lo amru kezayit ela leinyan korban. It quotes saying Rabbi Shimon says even the smallest amount that you eat of tebel, one would get lashes, and it makes no distinction here between chita or if it's ground flour, doesn't matter. Any little bit, one gets makot. Why do we say kezayit? Kezayit is only to make one liable to a korban if one ate it b'shogeg. So if you eat some tebel b'shogeg and you ate a kezayit, you have to bring a korban. If it was b'shogeg and less than a kezayit, then you don't have to bring a korban. But if it was done b'mezid, on purpose, then kol shehu, even the smallest bit, even 1 grain, even a little bit of ground flour, one would be liable to lashes. That brings us to the next Mishnah. Ha'ochel bikurim ad shelo kara alehem. If a kohen eats bikurim before the mikra bikurim, the farmer who brings the bikurim has to say the paragraph, Arami Obed Abi. So once he comes, he brings the basket, the kohen puts it next to the mizbeach, and the farmer says mikra bikurim, then the kohen can eat the bikurim. But before the farmer recites it, the kohen is not allowed to eat it yet. If he does eat it, he will get lashes. Kodshe kodashim, hus lakelaim, the holiest of sacrifices that only kohanim can eat, like a korban hatat, has to be eaten within the temple courtyard. If even a kohen who's tahor eats of the korban hatat or other kodshe kodashim outside of the courtyard, he gets lashes. Kodashim kalim umaser sheni chutz lahoma. Kodashim kalim are sacrifices that other people can eat while they're tahor. Korban shilamim, korban pesach, korban todah. The owner can eat it while he's tahor, but it has to be within the walls of Yerushalayim. Also, maaser sheni that the owner brings has to be eaten within the walls of Yerushalayim. If anybody would eat kodashim kalim or maaser sheni outside the walls, they get lashes. Hashober et ha'esem ba'pesach ha'tahor. Breaking a bone in the korban pesach, the Torah says, you have to eat it as if you're on the run. So you can't sit and break the bone and suck out the marrow. You have to eat it like a quick barbecue. And if it's a tahor, korban pesach, which you're permitted to eat, and you must eat, in fact, and not have any leftovers, you are not allowed to break the bone. If you break the bone, Makkot, 40 lashes. Aval hamotir batahor vashober betameh eno lokeh 40. However, if someone leaves from Korban Pesach overnight, you're supposed to eat it all that night. But if it's left over past the morning and it's tahor, it's one that can be eaten, one does violate a lav, but there is no malkut 40. And we know why, because that's lav hanitak la'aseh. It says, and if there's any leftovers, you should burn it. So there's a way to rectify the prohibition by burning it, and therefore that's not a problem. And also, if one breaks the bone of a tameh korban, it cannot be eaten. So breaking the bone is not liable to lashes. Hanotel em al banim Rabbi Yehuda omer lokeh ve'eno meshaleach. If someone takes the eggs or the chicks while the mother is there, that is a violation of a lav, and Rabbi Yehuda says once you violate that, you get lashes. You can't send away the mother bird after you already took it. That's it. It's too late. So there's no rectification. Hachamim omrim meshalech ve'no lokeh. Hachamim disagree, and they think that you can send away the mother bird even after you took the eggs, and you can still rectify it, and therefore you do not get lashes. Zekilal kum misvat lo taseh sheyesh ba kum aseh en hayvin aleha. The general rule is that anytime you have a misvat lo taseh that is attached to a misvat aseh, so then you don't get lashes, and that would be the explanation of Korban Pesach that you left over, and would be, according to Chachamim, the explanation of why one does not get lashes for taking the eggs, because you could do a misvat aseh to rectify the sin. Amar Rabba bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan Zo Divrei Rabbi Akiva Setim Ta'a. Rabba bar Chana says this Mishnah, the part about the Bikurim specifically, is only the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who says it in an unattributed way. Although it doesn't say Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he agreed with Rabbi Akiva. He wanted to present that as the halacha, so he presented it anonymously. So it's anonymous, but in fact, it's only the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Aval chachamim omerim bikurim hanacha me'akevet bahem kirya en me'akevet bahem. However, the other sages think that when it comes to first fruit, if you don't place it alongside the altar, that's a problem. If the Kohen would go and eat the fruit while it's in the basket, before he puts the basket next to the altar, that's not allowed, and he gets lashes. But as long as he put it next to the altar, even though the farmer did not yet read Mikra Bikurim, he didn't say the whole Arami Oved Abi, and he eats it then, a little prematurely, the Kohen's a bit hungry, then that is not a necessary step, and he will not get lashes for eating it before Mikra Bikurim. That's against the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if he eats it before Mikra Bikurim, he gets lashes. No, he just has to place it, but even before Mikra Bikurim, no lashes. Now the Gemara asks, why does it say this is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, and doesn't say that this Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon in an unattributed way? And the answer is, it wanted to teach us that Rabbi Akiva agrees with Rabbi Shimon. This is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who is the student of Rabbi Akiva. Nevertheless, sometimes there are disagreements even between Rabbi Akiva and his students, and that's why we know already that Rabbi Shimon thinks this. We know this from the following Baraita that we're about to read. But over here, the Rabbah Bar Chana wanted to teach us something extra. He could have said, oh yeah, this is Rabbi Shimon, but we could have figured out from the Braita by telling us this is in fact Rabbi Akiva. Now we know that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shimon agree. So let's see. My Rabbi Shimon. Where does Rabbi Shimon say anything about this? Detanya. We're now going to quote a long baraita that is interpreting the following pasuk. The pasuk in Devarim 12:17 says, "Lo tuchal lechol bish'arecha." You may not eat in your own gates the following things. Rather, Kim lifnei Adonai Elohecha tochelenu makom shebechad Adonai Elohecha bo. The following things you have to eat in the Mishkan and eventually only in Yerushalayim. And then it gives a list of things. Ma'asar deganecha v'tiroshecha v'yisarecha. The tithe of grain, wine, and oil. Bechorot bekarecha. The firstborn of your herds and flocks. V'sonecha. V'chol nedarecha. Anything that you vow to give, any korban. Asher tidor. V'nidbotecha. Utrumat yadecha. Your free will offerings and your contributions. So now we're going to go through each of these things, each of these items, starting from Bechor, to say, what does this pasuk add that we didn't know before? So here's the Baraita. Might be Shimon. Where do we see Rabbi Shimon's opinion? In this Baraita, Detanya utrumat yadecha elu bikurim. When it says the gifts of your hand, over here, it's actually at the end. We're starting from here, Tirumat yadecha, then we'll go backwards to the other items. Vinid botecha is actually before that. Okay, so starting with the end of the pasuk, Tirumat yadecha, and this is bikurim. Amar Rabbi Shimon, ma ba lanu lelamed. Rabbi Shimon says, what is this coming to teach us that I didn't know already from the fact that that you can't eat bikurim if you're outside of Yerushalayim? Im leochlan chus lachoma kavachom mimaaser akal. If it's to teach us that you cannot eat bikurim outside the walls of Yerushalayim, I could figure that out. A kavachomer me from maaser. Maaser sheni has to be in Yerushalayim, and that's a relatively lenient law. Bikurim is more stringent. The Gemara later will discuss in what way it's more stringent. So if Maaser Sheni cannot be eaten outside of Yerushalayim, then of course Bikurim cannot be eaten outside of Yerushalayim. So this pasuk is redundant. What else is it coming to teach us? Here's a kavachomer. If Maaser, which is lenient, and you eat it outside Jerusalem, you get lashes. Bikurim, which is more stringent, all the more so. Haloba katuv ela laochel mi bikurim ad shelo kara alehem shu lokeh. Rather, this comes to teach us that if a kohen eats bikurim before the farmer says the paragraph of Arami Obed Avi, that he gets lashes. So here's we see that Rabbi Shimon is in agreement with Rabbi Akiva, which is in agreement with the stam of our Mishnah. So that's it. We already have our answer what Rabbi Shimon said. But since we quoted part of the Braita, we're going to quote the entire Braita. So, ve'nidbotecha zo toda ushlamim. When it says nidbotecha, your free will offerings, that is referring to korban toda, korban shelamim. That's a free will offering that if someone wants to give it, he feels like he's especially feeling thanksgiving for something good that happened to him, he can bring it. Amar Rabbi Shimon, ma ba'zeh lelamdenu im lochlan chusachom ma'kavachom mima'aser. What is this pasuk coming to teach us? Rabbi Shimon asks. If it's coming to teach us what the simple reading of the pasuk is, that you're not allowed to eat it outside the walls of Yerushalayim, I could figure that out from a kavachomer, from Maaser. Maaser sheni cannot be eaten outside. of the walls, and that's a lenient law. And this is a korban, which is much more stringent. So of course you can't eat it outside the walls of Yerushalayim. Rather, it's telling us that someone who eats from korban todah and shelamim, before the blood is sprinkled, then he gets lashes. Someone, let's say an owner, right, bring his korban todah, so he brings it, and then someone slaughters it, and then the kohen takes the blood and has to sprinkle it on the mizbeach. From that point on, then people can go and eat the rest of the korban. But before sprinkling the blood is prohibited, and one gets lashes. Ubecharot. Now back to the pasuk, it says also firstborn. Zeh bechor. Yes, that is in fact the firstborn. Nothing new there. Amar Rabbi Shimon, ma ba zeh lelamedenu im la'achlan chutz lachomach kavachom maaser. So Rabbi Shimon again asks, why does the pasuk have to include firstborn animals here? If it's that to teach you that you can't eat it outside the walls of Yerushalayim, all the more so I know that Maaseh Sheni you can't eat outside the walls. Bechor, of course you can't eat outside the walls. Bechor only a kohen eats. It has a sense, has a level of holiness. Im lifnei zirika kavachom mitodah shelamim. A bechor that's tahor and the unblemished has to be sacrificed. So and then the kohen can eat the rest. If it's if you're talking about before the blood is sprinkled, then I know that already, all the more so from Todah and Shelamim, that the nobody can eat it before the blood is sprinkled. Here also, of course, nobody can eat it before the blood is sprinkled. And the answer is coming to teach us that even someone who eats of the bechor, who's not a kohen, even after the zerikah, then that person gets lashes. Unlike the previous one, Todah Shlamim, anyone can eat it as long as they are tahor and within the walls of Yerushalayim. It's not limited to a kohen, but a bechor has to be in by the kohen. So if a non-kohen eats it, even after the blood is sprinkled, then he gets lashes. Now this is actually attached to, in the Peshat, attached to Bechor, right? Bechorot bekarecha v'sonecha. But this Midrash is reading it stand alone. So what are these animals referring to? Zo chatat ve'asham. That's the korban chatat and korban asham, which are kodshei kodashim, only in by the kohanim within the temple, within the walls of the temple itself, not Yerushalayim, within the temple courtyard. Amar Rabbi Shimon, what is this coming to teach? If it's to teach me that I can't eat it outside the walls of Jerusalem, of course, this is much more holier than Maaser Sheni. If no one can eat it, not even Kohanim can eat it before the sprinkling of the blood, I know that from the Kodashim Kalim, Mitodah Shlamim. So for sure, these you can. If it's that that a non-Kohen cannot eat it even after the blood is sprinkled, I would know, I could figure that out from Bechor. Halo ba katuv ela laochel mechatat ve'asham afilu lachar zerika chutz lakelaim shehu lokeh. Rather, I learned from here that one cannot eat from the chatat and asham, even the kohen, even after the blood is sprinkled, if he's outside of the curtains of the Mishkan or outside of the temple courtyard. And so, unlike the ones before that could be in Yerushalayim, this has to be in specifically within the temple courtyard. Nedarecha zo olah. And now the word nedarecha is coming to include olah, which nobody can eat ever. The whole thing gets is sacrificed on the mizbeach. Amar Rabbi Shimon, what is the inclusion of korban olah coming to add in this pasuk? If it's that you can't eat a olah outside of the walls of Yerushalayim, I know that this olah is much more important than maaser. If it's before the sprinkling of blood, I know that from Todah Shlamim. This is like Chad Gadya. If it's to teach me after the blood is sprinkled, all the more so from Bechor, I know that from Bechor. If it teaches me that you can't eat a korban olah outside of the temple courtyard, I can learn that from a kavachomer, because olah is even more important than chatat and asham. Halo ba katuv ela lachel min haolah lachar zirika afilu bifnim shehu lokeh. Rather, it's coming to teach us that nobody, not even a kohen, nobody can eat an olah, not even after the blood is sprinkled, not even within the courtyard. backyard, and there is no situation in which one can eat or korban olah. Nobody can. And so that the pasuk has to come include that to add this level also. And now we understand why this Braita is interpreting the words out of order, because it's going from the least severe, that, okay, what do I learn from there? And then to the next, the more chamur, because it can build on the lesser, the law of lesser severity to add yet another prohibition and another limitation to the ones that come up next. That's the end of the Braita. Amar Rava, Dilida ime kerebi Shimon teled, ve'ila la teled. Rava is so impressed by this brilliant Rasha. He says, any mother who is going to give birth to a child like Rabbi Shimon, she should give birth. But it's not going to be like Rabbi Shimon. Don't bother. We need more Rabbi Shimons in the world. They're so rare. So let's try to give birth to more Rabbi Shimons. Even though there is a refutation to what he said. So after he gave this amazing compliment, everybody who's ever born should be like Rabbi Shimon. But there is actually a problem with what Rabbi Shimon said. מהי חומרה דביקורים ממעשר, שכן אסורים לזרים? אדרבה, מעשר חמור, שכן אסור לאונן. In what way was Rabbi Shimon assuming that bikurim is more stringent than maaser sheni? Is it that bikurim is prohibited to non-kohanim, whereas maaser sheni anybody can eat? Well, yeah, that is true. That is a stringency that way, but there's also a stringency the other way, in which maaser sheni is more chamor, because in Onen, someone who lost a loved one on that day, in acute mourning before burial, cannot eat maaser sheni, that has to be in happiness, but can eat bikurim. So there's stringency the other way. So that's refutation of that step. And in what way was Rabbi Shimon assuming that todan shelamim korbanot are more stringent than maaser sheni? Sheken tonim matan damim ve'emurin legabe mizbeach. Well, those are korbanot, so they have to put the blood and the innards on the mizbeach, which you don't do for maaser. Adraba maaser chamor sheken tonin kesef surah. But you could say that maaser sheni is more chamor in that if you want to redeem it, you need to use minted money that's minted, whereas disqualified Todah and Shelamim are redeemed with anything of value, and it doesn't have to be a minted coin. So there's a chumrah the other way. And you're assuming that Bechor is more stringent than Todah and Shelamim. Well, is that because a Bechor is holy from birth, whereas Todah and Shelamim have to be designated as a sacrifice. Okay, that is true, but you can also argue the other way. Adraba, Todah Shelamim chamurim sheken tonin semicha unsachim utnufat chazev veshok. The Korban Todah and Korban Shelamim require simicha, that the owner put his hands on top of it and has to bring libations, and he has to wave the breast and the thigh, and you don't have to do that for Bechor. And in what way was Rabbi Shimon assuming that Chatat and Asham are more stringent than Bechor? Sheken Kodshe Kodashim. They are Kodshe Kodashim. Bechor is only Kodashim Kalim. Adraba Bechor Chamor Sheken Kedushato Merechem. But Bechor is stringent in that it's holy from birth, whereas Chatat and Asham are regular animals when they're born, and then one designates them as a korban. Umay chumra de olam mechatat v'asham sheken kalil. Adraba chatat v'asham chamiri sheken bechaperi. And you're assuming that olah is more stringent than chatat and asham because it's entirely burnt. That is true. But there's also in a way the opposite, that chatat and asham are more chamor because they atone for sins, whereas korban olah is a voluntary offering and does not atone for sins. And in fact, all the korbanot that are listed in the Braita are in a way more stringent than olah because they have two consumptions: consumption by part of it on the altar and consumption by someone who eats it, either the kohanim or the owners, whereas a korban olah is only consumed by the altar and not by anyone. And so two eatings, two consumptions is better than one. And so for every kal vachomer that Rabbi Shimon brought, one can bring an opposite kal vachomer, and therefore it's piricha, it is refuted. Ela mai delida imek Rabbi Shimon. So therefore, why did Rava say that anyone who gives birth should give birth to a child like Rabbi Shimon. If everything he said can be refuted, so what's so special? And the answer is that the thesis that Rabbi Shimon himself felt was true, he was able to derive by moving around all the parts of the pasuk. As we saw, he starts with the last word of the pasuk and then goes backwards. And you see how brilliant it is that he did that, because he had to start with what, according to him, what is kal and chamor. He had a theory about what's kal and chamor. So if you accept that, then you see how he chose the last word to do first, because he felt that that was the most kal, and then you can build something on that, and then you assume that, and then you could build something on that. So the argument that he built was actually brilliant, even though Ravad disagrees with the logic of it, but the way that he attached the argument to the pasuk and moved around the words in the pasuk in order for the order of his argument to make sense, that was brilliant. And so Ravad was so impressed by that, he says, I wish everyone who gives birth should give birth to a child like Rabbi Shimon. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.